Hello, I'm John Powell. This time we're talking with former State Representative Sheehan Donoghue, who was a Republican representing Merrill, Wisconsin from 1973 through 1985. Also served in the state bureaucracy and, among other things, helped campaign for Lee Dreyfus for governor in 1978. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for asking me to join you. This is
Well, let's start at the beginning. Can you give us a little of your background leading to where and how and why you got involved in politics?
well, John. I really was always interested in politics. I come from a family that used to have shouting discussions at the dinner table about politics and life and everything, history, whatever, government. And I was a graduate of the University of Wisconsin with the equivalent of a double major. I had a declared major in political science and the equivalent in history. And after I got out, I ended up going out to Washington, D.C., and I got a job at the Republican National Committee in the research division, and I worked there for about a year and a half, and we were involved in the first actual successful Nixon campaign back in 1968. And then in 1969, I went to work on a temporary job for the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health. I was the assistant to Dr. Jean Mayer, who was the White House consultant for that. It was known as the Hunger Conference back in those days. It was quite an experience, I can tell you. That was during the days of the marches on Washington. It was, you know, you had the Black Panthers who were involved in various things, and like at one point they invaded the kitchen to blow up the hotel because they were upset with what was going on. But everything calmed down and we talked it down, etc. And La Raza was involved, and some of the migrant workers were upset anyway because of the use of raisins in a ham sauce. Those were the types of things that suddenly would escalate. And then when I left there, I went up to New York City and worked for a couple of years in lead poisoning control and preventive medicine. I was one of the three, what they called management analysts at that time. We had a very sophisticated kind of system that they went out into the 5 boroughs of New York with doctors and nurses and went door to door and tested children for lead levels in their blood. In the first year I was there, which was it was in 1970. I started in July of 1970, and we had over 2,400 cases, and we defined a case of lead poisoning as 60 micrograms of lead or more in the blood. And so then we would...
That's a lot, I take it.
That's a lot of lead in the blood.
And you found 2,400 positives?
Yeah. Oh, we had many more positives than that, but that was the minimum in terms of it becoming a case. We had some that were less than that we didn't call a case, but and the chairman or secretary of the Department of Health had a great deal of power back in those days, and she could issue an order, a commissioner's order, and we had what they called sanitarians who would go in, and first they would send a letter to the owner of the building, and if repairs were not begun within 5 days, we would go in and make the repairs and then put a lien against the landlord's the ownership.
The property,
yeah, the property. And maybe that's why New York ended up in so much trouble. There were an awful lot of places that did nothing to correct the problem. Back in those days, and it may still be, lead had a kind of semi-sweetish taste in the paint chips, and if you were hungry, and if your crib was right near a wall or a windowsill, you could pick off pieces of flaking paint and suck on it, and you got lead poisoning. In fact, an interesting side effect, and then I'll get back to the main thing here, was back in those days, Claire Booth Luce was the U.S. ambassador to
Italy.
Italy, and they were redoing the ambassador's residence, and they continued to work there while they were redoing it. And she came home after about 15 months, desperately ill, and it turned out she had lead poisoning, and it had sifted down from the ceiling and got into, they breathed the dust, it got into all their food, and everyone was ill. And so they had to, what they call, chelate the lead out, which was to pull it out of the bones and the blood. And it's, takes a while to get it all out.
Yeah, that's a terrible problem. Do you think progress has been made?
I think progress has been made, a great deal of progress. They have banned lead in paint from about the time we were working on it in New York City. And for instance, pencils and things like that would have lead in the paint on the pencils. And in fact, I had these dishes that somebody had given me that were from Mexico, that were hand painted. And I have this Greek stew that I do, and you put the onions on the top of the Greek stew, and then you put the plate on top of that. And I came home and found that the plate had turned brown. And it turns out, I took it in just for testing, just out of curiosity, turned out to be the highest level of lead in anything that they had. So that type of thing. Anyway, I came home from New York City. I really didn't. Back in those days, I was still smoking. Thank God I quit. And I came home and found out there was a brand new assembly seat available that had been created, and I kind of like to think that I replaced 3 men when I was elected back in '72 in November. But I decided to throw my hat in the ring. I had thought about doing it a few years before that when I was still working at the Republican National Committee. But Joe Sueda was a representative at that time for Lincoln County. My home, Merrill, was within Lincoln County. And so I didn't think I could probably defeat Joe Sueda. So when this new district opened up...
that was with reapportionment?
Yes.
Ah.
And it was made up of all of Lincoln County, everything in Langlade County except for the city of Antigo and 3 townships, 1 township to the north and 2 townships below. And half of Oneida County, it had the city of Rhinelander, which stuck out like a thumb like this, and then it went up like this and included Minocqua and Hazelhurst and Lake Tomahawk, but did not include any part of Vilas County. So Woodruff was not in the district, nor some of the townships to the east of Rhinelander. So it was really kind of in fact, I put the map on for people to see. It kind of looked kind of like that for the whole district. So I ran in 3-way primary, and I was not the favored fair-haired person to win that. The Republican caucus down here really wanted an individual from Tomahawk to win. I'm not going to mention names here. And I knew that the guy running from Antigo was the guy to beat. And as it happened, it really was a tough campaign. I just kind of went everywhere. And the guy from Antigo gave me a very stiff run for it, but I was able to win the primary. And then I had a 3-way general election. The chairman of the Lincoln County Board was the Democrat candidate, and there was an American Party candidate, which is kind of like a conservative, almost like the Tea Party now. I might liken it to that candidate. I was considered a moderate Republican. So, and I won that. And, I didn't have a whole lot of money, although I came from what was considered a well-to-do family in the area. I personally did not have an awful lot of money, and so we ran the 3-way primary for $1,300, and the combination of the primary and the general election, and just a huge area, these 3 counties, we spent a total of $4,000 in between the primary.
On both?
On both.
Wow.
On both of them. So just to give you a little perspective, back when I ran in the special election back in 1983 for Senator Krieger's seat, which I lost, I spent $40,000 in that. I put like 16,000 miles on the car in 6 weeks. That was, you know, I ran, my district was within Senator Krieger's district, and that was a huge district. That was 12 counties. It was larger than 7 of the 9 congressional districts here in the state of Wisconsin at that time. But, you know, it was a wonderful experience. To me, being in the legislature was the greatest honor anyone could ever have given me, and the people, the 35th Assembly District gave me that.
Now, the campaigning, obviously you didn't spend a lot on advertising.
No.
Did you buy time on radio stations? TV
Yes,
would have
TV
been,
was out.
Yeah.
The only time we ever used TV was once or twice during the Senate race, and probably shouldn't have, because I'm really not what you'd call photogenic for the television cameras.
They also say you have to buy huge packages
Oh,
of
you do?
spots if you don't buy 30 a week or more.
Well, that's now. I'm
Forget
not
it.
sure what it was then. We didn't do anything like that.
Yeah.
We couldn't have afforded it. As it was, I ended up spending, instead of $40,000, it was like, no, it was 40. I had to take a $3,000 personal loan out to finish paying all of the expenses and everything. Because, you know, up in northern Wisconsin, people don't have that kind of money, generally, by and large. So it's not like these districts down here.
So for the assembly, then,
Yes.
it was mostly door-to-door, to the extent you can
Oh,
do
yes.
it in a very
Door to
rural
door,
county.
And every time I ran for office, it seemed like I gained weight. It was awful, because, you know, you'd go to all the volunteer fire departments and the town hall meetings, and everything had food, and everything was homemade, and you didn't want to insult anyone, so you, of course, ate. It was just a disaster for my physical look.
So what was the legislature like when you arrived?
Well, you know, there was only one other Republican woman, and there were 7 Democrat women. There were a total of 9. There were 4 elected the same year I was elected. Esther Luckhart was the other Republican woman. She was more conservative than I am. And, excuse me, and then there was Mary Lou Muntz and Midge Miller and Joanne Duran and Louise Tesmer and Janet Milkey, and I'm missing 1 or 2, I think. In any event, and the rest were, of course, men. So back in those days, you know, you could smoke on the floor of the assembly. You ate. There was no air conditioning like there is now. We were in all night, many nights. Sometimes we had one 36-hour stretch in which we were in. And back in those days, the women's room was all the way around in one of the other wings. And so when there was a call of the House, it got to be very frustrating, because when you wanted to go to the restroom, you had to take 2 pages with you.
The men's room was within the
Within
territory of the call.
what
yeah.
they call the area there. Eventually, Barb Ulichny, who was in the assembly with me, and myself, got passed at the State Capitol and Executive Residence Board Committee, we call it SCRB, permission to have a women's room within that area.
The men's room was divided, so it
Yes.
furnished a women's room.
So we called it the Donoghue Ulichny Memorial Jane, which was kind of fun. We were always kind of tweaking, our male counterparts.
And at that time, no women in the Senate.
No, none.
But progress has been made on that score. Do you think it helped to have more women later?
Oh, absolutely. I think it helped a great deal. I think that women bring a moderating influence usually. I wouldn't say always, but I would say most generally women bring a moderating influence into the legislative halls.
Before we go any further,
Sure.
tell us a little about Tiny Krieger.
Oh, Tiny was a character in and of himself.
State Senator Clifford Krieger.
State
And
Senator
many
Clifford
years in the state Senate.
Krieger.
Also from Merrill.
From Merrill. He lived a block from me. And we would drive to Madison and back every week. And I would do the driving usually, almost, I would say 99% of the time. And we would stop and pick up Senator Chilson. And we often said that we should have had a tape recorder in that car, because we would often pick up people like Bill Bablich or Ed from Wausau.
Yeah, I know who you mean.
He has subsequently died. I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, we would have a full car, Republicans and Democrats, and we'd have just fascinating discussions, and there would be 3 subjects, and in no particular order: religion, politics, and sex. And it was, I mean, Tiny Krieger was Lutheran. I'm Catholic. Chilson is Catholic. Bablich was Catholic. Ed was more of a fundamentalist type, because he was originally from West Virginia, I believe. And I can't think who else might have been riding with us. Anyway, we really got into some Donnybrook kinds of discussions, because I was pro-choice, even though I am Irish Catholic, and both Chilson and Krieger were pro-life as they defined those issues. Tiny was a Missouri Synod Lutheran and would hold forth at length. I kind of really missed on one of the subjects. There really was a 4th subject, but it kind of was woven into the other issues, and that was the circus.
Oh, yes.
Because Tiny, when he was a young man, was a fat boy in the circus. And it was all on the up and up. His parents approved of his going just for the summers. And he said it was a great equalizer, and he learned a great deal about human nature when he was in the circus. And he had a love of the circus that went beyond all comprehension. And in later years, there was a young man from Gleason who was starting a circus, and so Tiny would travel all over and help him book different dates in different places. I remember we went out to Barneveld, where Walter John Chilson's wife, Rose, was from, and we booked in there. I remember sitting outside the Catholic church there, which was going to be hosting it, and Senator Chilson and Senator Krieger went in, and Senator Cy Bidwell from Portage and I sat out visiting out in the parking lot, for about an hour, hour and a half, and then the 4 of us went out for dinner down in Barneveld. But, those were the kinds of, interesting side things you did that you learned. You learned a great deal about human nature in having these conversations.
Ed McLean, I believe.
Thank you.
I finally thought of the name.
Yes, thank you. It was Ed McLean. I don't know. Yeah.
So I believe that Clifford Krieger said that he was perhaps a liberal Republican, if there was such a thing at the time.
He was.
That he was learned compassion for the ordinary folks and the downtrodden folks with his experience at the circus. Is that a fair?
That's true. That's very true. In fact, the first time he ran, he didn't win, but he ran as a progressive Republican. And remember that was in the days of the progressives. La Follette, became a Republican, and then another La Follette became a Democrat, and you had Nelson, who was a progressive. you had all sorts of Republicans and Democrats who had been part of the Progressive Party.
Yeah,
But
when the party dissolved, the Progressive Party in '46, I believe,
yes,
many of them became Democrats, but Tiny Krieger became a Republican.
that's correct. And there were others who became Republicans as well. Tiny, and I kind of likened myself to Tiny on the social issues and on you have to take care of people sometimes. When you reach the point where you cannot care for yourself, you have to have some means to get some help for people. And so there were times in my own caucus where I was almost persona non grata because I was considered a liberal Republican as well.
And so what do you think of the party today?
Just a moment. I had to have a sip of water on that. I'm very disappointed. I'm actually disappointed in both parties, if you want to know the truth. Here in the state, I think the Republicans have become far, far, far too conservative. I think they no longer represent the middle of the road people, the everyday people who, work hard. And the Democrats have become too liberal, and they don't seem to talk to each other. Back when I started out, at least, Republicans and Democrats would fight like the devil on the floor of the assembly and go out together and have a beer in the evening. You got to know each other. You got to know who you could trust and who you could not trust. You kind of really talked through a lot of pieces of legislation, out at the watering holes, just kind of learning about the types of people you were working with. There isn't much of that goes on now. Near the end of the time I was there, that was decreasing. I just, to get back to the Republicans, I think that I am still nominally a Republican, although I'm not comfortable in the Republican Party right now. I would liken myself more to being an independent. I think that I'm liberal on social issues, and I'm more conservative on fiscal issues. I think it's important for us to remember that at some point the cookie jar goes dry, and you can't keep taxing people out of their houses. But on the other side of the coin, you need to bring your spending into line with what your budget is. Or if you have a budget that isn't in a structural deficit situation, which unfortunately under both Republicans and Democrats, it was.
We'll get back to that, but is there any talk back and forth in today's assembly?
I honestly don't know because I haven't been around there much lately.
Do you ever think, we're not that old.
I know.
Happen to know that you and I are almost exactly the same age.
Because we graduated from college
we
together.
We were classmates at the UW
Yes.
Madison, though we never met. Only 5,000 people in the class.
Until the end, when you came to a party that I had.
That would have been in '66.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we're not that old. You ever get the bug to run again or get back into it?
Not for the legislature in the assembly. There was a time when I thought about perhaps running for Congress or something else, but I kind of like having my privacy now. I like being able to do the things I want to do. I'm kind of semi-retired. I'm practicing law part-time, doing just some guardian ad litem work for children who are torn apart in difficult divorces, or if the parents aren't married, they're still fighting over the children. But I have to admit that I have thought about it, but I don't know which party I would run on, and I probably would not get elected now because I am pro-choice. I do favor some sort of an accommodation for people who are homosexual, who may want to have like a civil relationship, or a civil like contract. I don't believe that you should necessarily call it marriage, but I do think that people should be able to unite and care for each other as they get older.
As we speak, there's a vacancy. Dave Obey has retired.
I see
or
that.
announced his retirement. There's an open seat there.
But I don't live there anymore, in that district.
Oh, the Vilas Hall isn't?
Vilas County is in the 8th Congressional District now. It used to be in Dave Obey's district. I understand that there's a Republican from up in Bayfield, a district attorney is running, and I understand that the senator from Stevens Point.
Decker? No, Decker
No,
has decided
that's
not
Wassa.
to.
I'll tell you her name in just a moment.
Lassa.
Yes, is running for that seat. So, no. I mean, that's 17 counties. That's, and I think, even though Dave Obey was pro-choice, I think the Democrats are going to have a tough run with that issue. Although I think the district leans now more Democrat than Republican. When Mel Laird represented the district, when he was appointed Secretary of Defense, which was when Obey ran against Chilson for that seat, Mel Laird was considered to be a more moderate Republican, and I think still is, at least the few times I've visited with him in recent years, it seems like he is.
We hear these days that people don't want to run for office anymore because of money raising, for one thing. But the other thing is you might be personally attacked, and why subject your family to that? Do you think that's going on
I think
today?
that's true, and I think it's appalling to see what has happened. There seems to be no sense of decency left. You can say anything you want. Now, a year or two ago, I read a book about the early times in America when, anything could go. It was pretty wild.
The Jefferson Adams
Yes.
campaign in 1800 was one of the nastiest
One
ever.
of the nastiest of all time. And, you had the Hamilton and Burr confrontation that ended in a duel. I mean, these are, but they didn't hesitate to say and write anything about the other person. I think that's, I had hoped, at least in our time, you didn't do as much of that. You tried to say why you would be the right person for it. I'm very disturbed at the tone of the things. It seems like the acrimony and the rhetoric is more inflammatory than it was, both statewide and nationally. I think it can get to be dangerous. I think there's a very unsettled feeling out among the people. I don't think they're happy with anyone that's in Congress right now. And I don't know about in the state legislature. I know that Don Frisky, who was one of the people who followed in my seat, who has just announced that he's not running again, was well respected and represented his district well. And most of the people before him who came after me did as well. But, I really wonder, I wonder what the future is going to hold. When you have someone who is of the caliber of Mary Hubler, for instance, who was a Democrat from Rice Lake, an excellent legislator, just excellent. I kind of felt sorry, or I feel very sorry, from the sense that you knew that if that caliber of person, like Don Frisky or Mary Hubler or Mary Panzer or people like that, were here in the legislature, that at least there was still some decency and there was some ability to talk to the other side and try to work out compromises with people. Jim Hopern's a good person for trying to work out a compromise. He is from up in Vilas County now. And people like that, I think, are very ethical and they work hard for their district. Now, I don't expect people, and I didn't at the time that I was in office, I never expected people to agree with me when I would cast a vote every time. I always used to say that every time you cast a vote, you made an enemy and you made a friend, and your enemies never forgot, and your friends did, because there might be another issue that came along, you know.
Any way to back out of the apparent bitterness and polarity now?
You know, I've asked myself that question, John. I wonder. I would like to see the money taken out of this, out of running for office. It seems to me that I don't know what an assembly seat costs now to run for it. Even if you go door to door in your district, you probably have to do. I would not do television if I were running for the Assembly or the Senate. Well, the Senate I might, because because the districts are so big up in the rural northern part of the state, or for Congress. But it seems like you have to spend all your time raising money instead of, you know, focusing on the issues that are bothering people. You know, particularly from your northern rural areas, you really are the ombudsman for the district. You know, people don't have a voice other than you. Now, I realize that there are lobbyists who represent various interests, and you know they have money, etc. But the people who you represent really need to have your understanding of the day-to-day issues and problems they face. And when they come to you and ask for your help, whether it is in the form of legislation or whether it's in the form of cutting through the red tape and the bureaucracy, you need to really focus on doing that and providing that kind of help.
People may not realize that. Of course, the focus is on legislation, but the constituent service that you're talking about is very important.
Oh, it's critical. It's critical. I think that if you took the money out of it and had people focus on providing good service and voting carefully based upon their knowledge of their district. It would also be nice, John, to see a greater cross-section of people who have jobs in the real world, who have worked in the real world before they ran for office. And
so should we go back to a part-time legislature?
I don't know that you can. I don't think that's possible. It would be nice if people could take more time to really be out in their districts, working with people and finding out what the issues are and holding office hours. You know, government has become so complex now that you really probably need to have a full-time legislature. And if anybody tells you, well, you know, we're only in for you know, 3 months of the year, I know states where they just hang a blanket over the clock, and that doesn't do anything.
They just stay there.
Yeah, they just stay there. And, you know, they get tired, and, you know, like when we have the all-night sessions like we used to have, those got to be interesting because not only was there a cloud of blue smoke, but there was, people were exhausted. They were just exhausted, and there were people going around taking pictures of people who would be sleeping in their chair. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. They were exhausted, and people were out cutting deals out in the hallways. But that goes on now, and it's gone on forever, and that's politics. That's how it goes. If anybody thinks that you can have everything out in the open, I think they've got another thing coming. And I know that sounds terrible, but you simply cannot sit down with someone and say, what is it in your district that you feel is so important that you have to vote for this? Is there something, you know, here is why I think this is not good legislation, and be able to discuss it with each other, just the two legislators, not, or someone from the Legislative Reference Bureau or the the Legislative Council to help each of you understand what the different issues are in the legislation. I just wish that there were less bills introduced each year, and I wish that perhaps people would go through and repeal some of the laws that are on the books. I also wish that the bureaucracy, and in fairness to them, Wisconsin has very hardworking people in our departments throughout government. I mean, I was a division administrator for a relatively small division, but it was a lot of hard work, and they were very explosive issues. People worked very hard, and they still do. And you are constantly getting orders from the Secretary of the Department or from the Secretary of the Department of Administration to cut back on the numbers of positions. And you can only cut back on so many positions before you have to decide whether you are going to provide that program or not. And there seems to be an unwillingness on the part of the legislature to recognize that when there is a program that needs to be run, you need to have enough people to run it. Otherwise, you should be prepared to eliminate that program and perhaps move some of the things that were being done into other areas within government and just save money that way.
If I remember correctly, Wisconsin has a very low number of state employees per capita compared to other states.
I don't recall what the number is, but it wouldn't surprise me that they did.
So you, after your service in the legislature, you became a bureaucrat, and I do not use that as a pejorative term.
I know.
Administrator of the Equal Rights and Standards Division. What was that like? Was that a surprise to you, how it worked?
Well, you know, when I got out of the legislature, I went to law school. I was 40 years old. And after I got out of law school, I really wanted to learn how to be a lawyer. So I spent about 4 years, 4.5, nearly 5 years, working for a law firm. And actually, they had just offered me a partnership, and I had accepted when they called and asked if I'd consider doing this. I'm glad that I did it. I think I was able to do some things with the people in my division that really benefited a lot of people across the state of Wisconsin.
Describe what the division does. You hear cases.
Sure. The Division of Equal Rights and Labor Standards enforces all the fair employment, fair housing, family and medical leave laws, all of the labor laws, the minimum wage, the 1 day of rest in 7, the plant closing law, the child labor. There are about 29 different laws that the Labor Division enforces as well. And the division contracts with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Washington, D.C. to process cases that are jointly filed both under the state of Wisconsin law and under the federal fair employment law. There are thousands of cases brought each year. We have, at the time I was the division administrator, there were 10 attorneys who were administrative law judges who heard cases, wrote decisions, and then people could make a decision whether they were going to go up further and file a complaint in civil court. It took a lot of burden off the civil courts for being able to resolve the issue at the level of the department. I think we did a lot of good. We had what they call the prevailing wage within labor standards. It's the construction wage. We set all the wage rates for everyone working on a public project. That is a major piece of the building and construction industry in Wisconsin. All of the public buildings that are built, whether it's this building or whether it's, well, actually it's not this building because this has public and private people in it. let's just say at the University of Wisconsin, every single building has to be, all the wages have to be approved and set through a system that we rewrote and put into place while I was the administrator there. I think I think we were able to do a lot to help both industry and labor in Wisconsin to really work together in a more in a friendlier environment. I have a feeling that since then it doesn't rub along quite as well as it used to.
So you decided to become a lawyer after you'd served 10 years or more in the
12
legislatures.
years, yeah.
Tell us about that decision.
Well,
Something you always wanted to do?
Well, actually, when I was in undergraduate, I was thinking about going to law school, and then I thought, gee, I want to get out and start earning a living. And so I didn't. But then after I ran in the special election for Senator Krieger's seat and lost, I decided that I really wanted to put myself in a position where I could support myself in the future and be beholden to no one. So I set about taking a course, the Kaplan course, on how to take the law exam, the LSATs, and I audited a course in the law school to see if I could handle the work. I was, it had been 20 years since I'd been in college, or close to it, 18, 19 years, and I really wasn't sure that I had the wherewithal to be there and graduate. But when I was accepted, I decided that I really should resign effective the end of '84 so that I could really focus on going to law school. And that's what I did. It was kind of a jarring experience for me at the beginning. It was kind of intimidating at first, but my counselor at the time was Gordon Baldwin, that you will recall, who was a great attorney.
Constitutional lawyer, and
Correct.
He served on the state elections board, I believe,
That's
later.
correct. And he also was a specialist in maritime law as well. Just a real class act of an individual. Very bright, very moderate in his approach to government and into the law, the study of law. He did caution me that law, the study of law, and being a lawyer can be a very lonely undertaking. And he was right. It is lonely. For someone who is as outgoing as I am and is, full of it, having kissed the Blarney Stone, I found it to be very hard. And I had to kind of literally pull my brain around to understand a legal way of looking at an issue. I was used to looking at it, granted from a legislator's viewpoint, but that was more to represent the people. It wasn't to look at it from a legal perspective. It was to solve a problem as I had heard about or seen in my district. And so I found it hard, but I'm very glad I did it. And I learned a great deal. And I think I also brought an interesting perspective into the law school, the same way Mary Lou Muntz and others did. I was sitting in Whitfield's class in tax, which, mathematical things have never been my strong suit.
Tax law doesn't sound too exciting.
No, it really doesn't. And so he was carrying forth down on the stage about a particular thing that the legislature had done. And I finally couldn't help myself, and I spoke up and said, Professor, it really wasn't quite like that. And then proceeded to tell about how it actually happened in the legislature. And I think that was helpful to people in the law school to at least see another side of how things actually happen.
You think An outgoing personality is not maybe necessary, but certainly helpful to a politician?
Oh, I think it is. It helps you to meet people. You know, you go in and shake hands and be willing to listen. I think the biggest thing that we need in our society today, whether it's a politician, but most certainly if it's a politician, or if it's in the law or in medicine or whatever it might be, is to learn how to listen. I don't think we know how to listen anymore. If we could just learn how to listen to each other in the legislature, you would find that a whole lot less of these outrageous kinds of comments would occur. We don't know how to listen, John.
People are shut in by their ideology now, their prejudices. Is that can't listen?
I think they just have never learned to listen. I think they have learned that in our society today, we're more centered on the individual and, you know, do whatever you want to do if it makes you comfortable type of thing. There are times when you have to stiffen your upper lip and do things within your own life that may be unpleasant, but have to be done. I mean, I had what I thought was a pretty stressful job as the division administrator, and at the same time I was caring for two parents, one more than the other at that time at the beginning, my father, who subsequently died, and then caring for my mother, who got progressively more ill with some dementia. And there are some unpleasant things you have to do, but you know, in life there's times when you have to do that. And that's true whether it's in the law or in the legislature and or in a job as a bureaucrat. I think you have to really first learn how to listen, but then figure out that, you know, in the end you have to do what you think is right, and you have to do what you think will solve a problem. And I'm not so sure we have as many people doing that who are listening to their constituents as we used to.
Speaking of one problem, I want to talk about a couple things
Sure.
before we're done. I want to
Sure.
get to Lee Dreyfus, who you
Yes.
campaigned for. Taxes.
Yes.
The perennial subject. You were on the Governor's Blue Ribbon Tax Reform Commission
I was.
in 1975. That was Patrick Lucy as
Yes.
governor. And since you solved all the problems then, maybe
Oh, sure we did.
you can tell us all about that.
Sure we did. We solved all the problems then. Well, being on that tax commission was a great experience. We had some very fine minds on that tax commission. The problems haven't changed a great deal since then. They've gotten worse. They're the same types of problems, though. I think in terms of taxes, we still, here in Wisconsin, have not found what I think is a fair way to fund education. And I think we have not gone about it correctly. I'm not sure that I have the solution, but I sure know that steadily increasing the state support for it and increasing the aid systems for it hasn't seemed to solve the problem. When I was in the legislature, I can remember going into meetings with my joint school boards and city councils, for instance, in Merrill, and having them all just, you know, throwing questions at me about the different things. But I will tell you that we increased the aid levels back for shared revenues and for school aids almost every year I was in office. And I never saw the taxes go down.
Property taxes, you mean?
Property taxes,
The
that
idea
is
was
correct.
supposedly to relieve
To
property
relieve
taxes.
property taxes, but it never did. And that's kind of true now.
Yeah.
And we still have greater and greater aid levels, but we have all sorts of new programs. If I had one vote to change, if I could go back and change it, knowing what I know now, and probably knowing what I knew when I got out of the legislature by that time. In my first year, we passed, and I voted for, a law that would mainstream people with mental and physical disabilities into the classrooms. And we set a start date for it. It was either 6 months or perhaps even a year afterwards. But we didn't allow, we really didn't know what we were doing right then, both to the taxes that would have to be raised and the aid that would have to be provided, nor did we understand that we didn't even have any teachers trained to handle the classrooms of children who are going into these classrooms with various types of disabilities. If I had one vote to change, it would be that. I would have tried to amend that law or that piece of legislation to, in effect, give us 5 years in which to get teachers trained to study the issue in depth and to provide the type of not only training but funding for it that would be necessary. I think what they've done now is we have these M teams in the schools for the various children, and I think they've done a lot of good, don't get me wrong, but they have cost a fortune for local school districts, and the state isn't providing the kind of funding that it should for that. That's just a perfect example of where we passed a program that exponentially raised spending, and we didn't even begin to comprehend what we were doing to the school systems and to the tax system in Wisconsin.
Is a drastic restructuring of the tax system? I mean, people talk about put schools on the sales tax, get a value-added tax, get the schools off the property tax, this sort of thing. Huge changes. Is that politically possible?
Something's got to be done. Lots of things we may say are not politically possible, but we're going to have to do something, because you can't continue to raise the property taxes when you see what happened with property values suddenly being wiped out in this most recent very bad recession that we were in. I think something dramatic has to be done, whether it's to revamp the entire tax system and either go to a flat tax and figure out what you were going to spend your money on, go back to zero-based budgeting and figure out what is most important to provide as a service in Wisconsin to our citizens. You know, the Tri-County boards for, you know, the 5142, 5, right, I can't remember the numbers now, you know, for mental health and drug abuse, et cetera, in the different counties. Those are wonderful and they provide a lot of help. But on the other side of the coin, they cost a fortune locally now. You know, I was involved in helping with getting the battered women's shelters and that legislation passed. But the battered women's shelters try to keep raising private cash for it. But it's really getting hard when you have all these other things going on. We need to look hard at our tax system. We need to look at whether we're going to do income tax with a sales tax. I would hope that we never apply the sales tax to food or to clothing for people who really need it, because it's the most regressive tax of all.
It's on clothing now, isn't it?
Is it on all clothing? You know, it is. You're right. I'm sorry. Food is what I'm looking at, that you buy in a grocery store. I don't mind having taxes on alcohol, cigarettes, luxury taxes. That's good. We should do that. If we need to increase it, we need to increase it. If you need to do a value-added tax, you may have to do that. But you need to first look at and understand the levels of taxation, the layers that are on people, and try to figure out how you can provide that. I mean, we're providing in Wisconsin badger care, which is wonderful, and we need to do something like that for people. But all of a sudden, we can't fund it.
We have just a little time left. Tell us about Lee Dreyfus, the '78 campaign.
Oh, it was a wonderful experience. Lee Dreyfus was a breath of fresh air. I'm so glad that I was able to be involved in that. We had really people, back in those days, a group of we who were moderate Republicans formed a group called the New Republican Conference. There were people like Steve Gunderson, who became the
Congressman, 3rd District.
3rd District Congressman. Very, very class act guy. Mary Panzer, myself, there was Mark Musoff, there were people like Paul became a priest and is now a bishop.
Dreyfus legal advisor later.
Yes, his legal advisor. You know, we had a whole cross-section group of people who were involved in Dreyfus's campaign and who really wanted to try to change the tenor of politics to make it more civil again. It was already starting to deteriorate back then, and to provide a more moderate approach to legislating and to solving people's problems. I think that because Lee knew how to speak the English language and how to get things across to people, he was wonderful. I wish he had not chosen not to run again. But I think he was concerned about the effect that being governor was having on his family. And he put that ahead of other things.
Now, some would argue that Dreyfus set up the budget problems ever since. The big campaign issue in '78 was give back the budget surplus, $1 billion, I think, huge money at that time.
Right.
And he was preaching what he called fiscal brinksmanship, put the state on a very lean diet. If the economy had continued to do well, he'd have been a hero. But unfortunately, the economy went into the tank a couple years, and so suddenly had a $2 billion deficit.
That's right.
And seems like the state has been struggling ever since, budget-wise.
We have. Lee was wrong on doing that. What he was trying to, the concept was right, to force people to force them to come up to the edge and budget correctly for what the needs of the people were and the programs were for the future. But we didn't, as legislators, we didn't see that what we were doing was taking money from the surplus and expanding the programs in such a way, whether we were giving it back as a straight cash amount or creating new programs, which a lot of that went on during that time. And so the cost just to continue led to the structural deficit in the future. There was nothing left in the cookie jar. Who was it? It was Governor...
Earl followed.
No, I know, but it was one of the early governors who said we should have a cookie jar, put the money in the cookie jar. I'll think of his name in a minute. In any event, we had nothing to go back to. There was no money to go back to resolve what was going on.
But Dreyfus was a delightful personality.
He was a delightful personality. I was somewhat disappointed, you know, 3/4 of the way through his term, in that he really was not as strong a governor as I would have liked to have seen. And it was because I think, even though he brought a new perspective to government, he really didn't understand what it meant to govern. And I think Lee loved to campaign. And if he could have campaigned his way all the way through being governor, it would have been great. But you have to govern. And unfortunately, I mean, I think the world of him. But he was not as good a governor as he could have been.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. This
Thank
has
you,
been very
John.
delightful.
It's been fun for me, too. Thank you for asking me.